backgrounds, some animation backgrounds once for short films and TV commercials, and that was because we couldn't get a real background painter. They either weren't available, they were busy. Keep in mind, this business used to be a very small business, very tiny business, huge today. But sometimes people were busy and you couldn't get them because they were already, oh, I'm tied up, I got a dozen jobs, I'm over here, I'm over there, I'm on track. You couldn't get them because we were such an obscure little business.
Really?
Animation was obscure. It was a quirky, odd job. When you told your parents or grandparents that you were going to go into the animation business, they were like, what? Don't you think you should get a job where you can earn a living and support your family? And you can't support your family on cartoons. Like, what is that? Very few people wanted to come into the animation business. Number one, because it was so little known. Nobody knew about it. I mean, they'd heard the name Walt Disney and they'd heard Looney Tunes, but those were entertainments they saw at the movie theater. But they never thought about that as being a career, Those of us who fell in love with it felt that way. We thought, this is what I want to do with my life. Yeah, but the average person, maybe they were just more grounded and they were thinking about practicality of going to college and learning how to do something, Eventually it became that way. I'm looking at Cal Arts, I'm going all the way back to the 50s and 60s when it was the art school and it wasn't that competitive. I mean, people who went to art school were looked upon as kind of odd anyway. You're going to college? Where? USC? UCLA? No, I'm going to Cal Arts. Oh, no, at the time it was called Chenard. I'm going to Chenard or I'm going to Art Center. And they were like, well, don't you think you ought to go to school and learn how to, so you can get a job when you finish, Nobody took art seriously. Even my parents didn't. My parents were kind of somewhat baffled that I wanted to work for Disney. I think if you're part of an artistic community or if your family has an interest in art, and so it becomes more acceptable. To the average person, it was looked upon as somewhat odd, quirky, And I remember young women graduating from high school and deciding they wanted to go to art school. And the parents were kind of like, oh, well, she wants to go, I don't know, I guess it's okay, And in those days, it wasn't as expensive. It wasn't that huge financial commitment it is today. It was a little easier to say, okay, well, we'll let her go to art school for a couple of years until she gets it out of her system and then decides to get serious about life. But I was, back in those days, I spent a lot of time at Chenard simply because we were all an artistic community. So you hang out with different people. It wasn't kind of like a rivalry. There was Otis, which is kind of the more prestigious. That's where the painters went to school, the serious artists. Then there was Chenard's, came Cal Arts. And they even had a relationship with Disney. And Disney was very supportive of Chenard's to visit. Yeah, I was a visitor, a regular visitor, because I was curious to see what they were doing, just hanging out. And because, you would have friends there. So it was mainly like, if you were a college kid, just like going to another campus, just hanging out with your friends. Like, what are you doing? What are you working on? What's your assignment? Just sort of art talk back and forth. Again, we were all, students, and it was kind of like this artistic community here in Los Angeles. And then there was Art Center, which was kind of like, Art Center they were positioned more as the serious commercial art school. You didn't go there to become a great painter or a sculptor. You went there to become an art director in advertising. We were very big on industrial, automotive design. And fashion. In those days, fashion was very big. Before we made the transition to photography, that we had a huge school of fashion doing marvelous fashion design. And I'm not even interested. I have no interest in fashion, not really. I don't even understand fashion. But I do recall some of the art that was being created there was just incredible. The men and women who were designing dresses and gowns and suits and like just great stuff. And all that's, again, that was that tangible art. You could feel and touch, and I do miss all that.
You were studying illustration?
Only because back then there were no classes in animation. That was the reason. People say, well, why were you studying illustration? I said, well, that's because that was the only, because I didn't want to go into advertising design, so I didn't focus on advertising because that was not my interest. I didn't want to be a photographer or a painter or a fashion designer, so the only thing left was illustration. And which made sense because in illustration you're learning the basics: drawing, design, composition, perspective.
Right. Who were some of your favorite teachers or your most influential teachers?
Lorsa Feidelson was probably the best known teacher. Feidelson, Harry Carmine, Eugene Fleury, his wife Bernice Polifka. She's a great design instructor, and I really loved her, Polifka. She was amazing, a huge influence in my life, design-wise. But we had great instructors. Who else? Jack Potter, Paul Souza was one of my painting teachers. Can't recall all the names. Midge Quinnell. Yeah, Midge Quinnell was another instructor of mine. See, the names are coming back now. This is the 1950s. And the reason I was at Art Center is because Disney told me that I should go to art school. Good advice. See what happened, I came to Disney right out of high school. I graduated from high school in Santa Barbara, so I was nearby, only 90 miles away. Santa Barbara High School, and the very next week after high school graduation, I drove down to Disney. 17 years old. I was only 17, just right out of school, and I had a portfolio. They looked at it and said, it's not a bad kid, but what we would advise, and it was good advice, was go to school and learn a thing or two about drawing, about painting, about design, about composition, and then come back. So they were very encouraging. It wasn't like, oh, no winner,
Okay, in art school, how exactly did these teachers, how did they take a raw talent and turn it into a polished talent? What was the difference between you 4 years later?
Yeah. I think number one is discipline. I learned discipline at Art Center, which is good because you come into school and you think that art is kind of like playtime. And I remember before our semester started, they had kind of like this preschool meeting where even before you started school they had this. You showed up on a Saturday, I think, and they gave you the rundown, like what you were in for. Like the fate of heart should leave now. If you're not ready to work hard, you shouldn't be here. So that was kind of like a wake-up call right there. They stressed that Art Center was going to be hard work, and they wanted every student to know that going in. It was not going to be playtime. You're not going to be coming into an artistic playpen, but you were here to study and to learn and to work hard. And that was the rule. And they stuck to that. So number one, I learned that art was not a playtime. It was a serious business. So that was my first lesson. But then, of course, everything else follows when you begin to go through your learning the basics, good solid drawing. Artists must know how to draw. You must have skills, design skills. You must understand composition. You must learn even some things that are tedious, like perspective, because perspective is like, oh God, do I have to take that class? Yes, you do, because you have to learn perspective, and it's tedious, it's tough, it's rigorous. But thank God they made us do that. All that's going to pay off later in your career. So they knew what we needed as young students, and so so we were taught these disciplines and came out the better for it. When artists work digitally as they do today, they now work in this digital paradigm, but you still have to have a steady.
Okay.
Yeah. It's not going to do it for you. If your hand shakes, you're going to get a shaky digital
jaggy line. Okay.
Yeah. So that doesn't change. The machine won't do it for you, and that is still a good thing. That there's a lot of people think that, oh well, you paint on the computer, right? Oh, you just press a button, the computer paints it for you. No, you still have to know what you're doing. You still have to understand. Most of our better painters, better artists come from traditional media. They started out working in watercolor and gouache and pastel and charcoal. They first had to learn that. Now all you're doing when you move over to digital, as we've had to do today, and even I've had to move over to it because, out of necessity, because that's the way the work is being done today. My wife was one of the few people who for some reason never resisted. When she found out that she was going to have to work on the computer and she had been working in traditional media. She just immediately jumped right into it. A lot of artists, they found that transition to be maddening. It just drove them crazy because having to put down their traditional tools and now to work on a screen with a stylus is like, oh my God, I don't know if I could do this. But she had that unique ability. That transition didn't bother her. Yeah, but I know it bothered a lot.
Okay, you say that you were inspired by Mary Blair's use of color.
Even when I was a child,
Really?
even before I knew who Mary Blair was, I was watching Disney films and just being totally blown away by the colors and the use of color I saw on the screen. And I realized even back then that there's a stylist, there's somebody doing this, and who is this person? Now, when I was probably around middle school, I remember going to see Alice in Wonderland, and I started reading all the screen credits because I wanted to know about these people. Couldn't find out anything about them because in those days there was no way to
No
find
internet.
No internet, no
Right.
books written about them. But at least I knew their names. So when I saw the credit, color and styling by Mary Blair and Claude Coates or John Hinch or whatever, these names just stuck in my brain. So I said, now I know who the people are who do this stuff, and maybe someday, who knows, I might meet them one day. I knew what she put on the screen. I knew her work, her mastery of color, and that just stayed with me. I knew all the voice actors. Yeah, I had all of that stuff memorized. And of course, naturally, I knew all the animators. I knew the directors. I knew these people long before I met them. So when I finally came to Disney as a kid, I was still old enough to get it. I was like 17. And I saw the names on the studio directory. I knew who these people were. I mean, I had been following their career for years as a child. And now here I was at the Disney studio, and I was seeing their names in the hallway of the studio directory, and it's almost like confirmation that they really do exist. They not only exist, they're here, and I felt like I had sort of entered the temple of the gods. It really was, I was honored just by being at Disney. I am finally here. All of these greats, where they do their work. That was very special to a 17-year-old. Very inspiring.
Now, by the time you arrived at Disney, Mary Blair had actually, I think she had left. She'd gone back to her.
She may have still been here. I mean, she could very easily have been here in Glendale. Keep in mind that when Walt Disney moved this small contingent of Imagineers, and they weren't even called that in those days.
Right.
They hadn't even coined that term. But this small group of artists that left the Burbank lot and they moved over to Glendale, right, a couple of blocks from here. Mary Blair could have easily have been in that group, and they were, I think, guys like Claude Coates left. I think Albertino, and of course John Hinch left,
Right.
and Mary could very well have been in that initial group that left Disney and moved over to Glendale, and so she was probably still around even at that time. But
Well, now in the animation studio, did people still talk about her?
Yeah. She was already legendary in the 50s. Well, I consider myself a latecomer because I didn't arrive until the middle 50s thereabouts. But Mary she was already well known in the 40s. She was doing all of this, incredible work in the 1940s. And so she was, people knew who she was, and they were very familiar with her work. And so, but it's almost as though Walt had he says, well, I think I've gotten all I want out of Mary in film. Now I've got this new thing I'm doing, this whole theme park thing. And I want Mary's input on Disneyland. And that was the next big thing, theme park. And so Walt kind of selected a select group of his top people to be part of this whole Disneyland thing. Herb Ryman, all of these guys, they were all pulled from the film department because there was no theme park department.
Right.
Everybody who came into theme park came from motion pictures. They were either animators or storymen or layout artists or designers or painters, and they just suddenly morphed into this new thing of being an Imagineer.
So Mary Blair was still famous. She was still legendary.
Yeah.
I had the impression that the animation department in some way moved on from her because Eyvind Earle and Walt Peregoy were the next two big guys. And did her style or did her influence wane a little bit?
I don't think it waned. I think Mary had just, like Walt, had just moved on. She just moved on to doing other things. And we had new designers coming in, guys like Eyvind Earle and Peregoy and others who were maybe going off in a different direction, yet probably in many ways probably still influenced by her work. But it wasn't that Mary was suddenly old hat or forgotten. I think she had just moved on. And so the studio was kind of moving in new directions with the unique styling on Sleeping Beauty. That was mainly Eyvind. The styling on Dalmatians, which was, Peregoy. So the studio was just trying to, and the stuff Ward Kimball was doing. Eyvind even worked with Kimball for a bit on his stuff. But Ward was pushing into this more stylized kind of.
Oh, was he?
Yeah. He had to fight Walt to do that stuff because Disney just didn't care for that. What would you call it? It wasn't the Disney house style that Walt was familiar with.
Right.
And Kimball wanted to take this new designy approach to animation, and he did some brilliant work. I mean, I thought the stuff he was doing, I was totally blown away by it. And his designers, guys like Tom Orab and others, just doing some great work, but Walt was always kind of uncomfortable with it. Although to give him credit, he let Ward do it. He let him do it. Although I don't think he ever really liked it.
Which film are you talking about, Dalmatians?
I'm thinking of the short films he did. For instance, he did a film called Melody. It's a really nice little short, well designed, stylized short cartoon. Not the usual Disney house style.
Right.
A real break from the Disney house style. Then he did Toot Whistle Plunk and Boom, which won an Academy Award.
Yes.
I mean, we often laugh that Walt didn't particularly like Toot Whistle Plunk and Boom, but he sure picked up the Oscar when it was announced as Best Picture. He picked up the Academy Award. And the cool thing about that film, even with its stylized approach to animation, it still had a Disney sensibility. So it wasn't a break from, you couldn't say, well, this is not a Disney picture, It still felt very much Disney, and I think that's why I think Ward Kimball was smart enough to keep that balance, to keep it in check. He didn't go off and do something radical just to be different. I think a lot of stuff I see today, it's almost as though the kids are trying to push it so far that, like, let's see how controversial we can be. Let's see how subversive we can be. Let's do something really radical. And they call it, what do they call it? Edgy. They call it edgy.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, and sometimes edgy gets to be almost offensive. And they really do look for today's projects in development. It's this ugly style that the studios or the producers think this is what the kids want. So it's like, oh, we can't do pretty stuff. Kids want edgy, so kids want ugly. So we have this whole series of just really wonky. Some of the stuff is interesting, but a large part of it to me is just ugly stuff. And then don't even get into some of the storytelling, which is now moved from it just moved to just